Hello, I'm so glad you're back. We are now in probably one of module 7 and module 8 are my favorite modules of the workshop. I love to talk about critical pedagogy, so this brings me a lot of joy because it's about action. All right, so critical pedagogy is rooted in the democratic relationship in which we create knowledge through inequality of learning between teachers and learners. Okay. Critical pedagogy was developed by Paulo Freire, and it is the social and political critique of the curriculum within everyday life through praxis. Praxis is our reflection and action of educational practices to create a better learning environment that contributes to a better world. Our praxis becomes an educational practice of how we relate to one another. So let's talk a little bit about Paulo Freire. So he was born in 1921 into a middle class family in Brazil. And unfortunately, Freire and his family became impoverished during the Depression. Freire struggled educationally and fell behind for grades. Although others labeled him unintelligent and lazy, he realized his inability to learn stemmed from stress and hunger. When his family regained middle class economic status, his educational performance improved. He attended university and studied the psychology of language and became a teacher. By 1947, he was the director of education and culture. It was there he connected oppression to literacy and educational praxis as critical pedagogy. And it was through Brazil's history of colonization, enslavement, and genocide of Indigenous peoples that informed Freire's critical pedagogy. Because by the mid 20th century, the situation in Brazil was very, very serious. Brazilians were suffering severe economic hardship and hunger that was insurmountable to the point for some people that to avoid starvation, people sold themselves and their families into illegal slavery. Freire eventually coined the colonial pedagogy, the banking concept of education, as an instrument of oppression. The student is passive and an empty vessel waiting for the teacher. The active participant is the teacher, of course, who imparts the knowledge. Freire likened the process of transmitting knowledge to depositing money in the bank. Ontologically, Freire believed that creating knowledge together increased learner humanity through critique. Colonial pedagogy decreases humanity because the colonizer imparts what they think best. When the teacher discourages critical thought, they are perpetuating oppression and dehumanization of both teacher and student. So this is part of Freire's critical pedagogy. It's called critical consciousness, and um, it involves the perception of social, political, and economic contradictions through praxis. By achieving an in depth understanding of the world through exposure to social and political contradictions, one becomes aware of the oppressive elements collectively and individually in one's life. Freire insisted on the interconnectedness of theory and practice to develop critical consciousness. It is not about learning how to ask the right questions, it is about applying one's findings to alter material and social circumstances to facilitate change. Achieving critical consciousness and facilitating its development in others is difficult. It is also emancipatory. Those engaged must wish to participate. Students, through critical pedagogy, realize the contradictions in their social, political, and economic, gender, identity, and class conditions and act to resolve them. Critical pedagogy is a problem solving form of education. Teachers problematize each issue discussed in class. Students pose their solutions. Teachers and students work together in both goal and process to implement change. Teachers and students achieve the democratic ideal of freedom and equality for all. The process of problem solving is rooted in dialogue, in which the basis of critical pedagogy requires solidarity, a sense of equal footing, and mutual respect. And I will just comment that mutual respect involves the truth as well, which connect we will be talking more in a couple more slides in relation to the guide. Link through the PBLA and task-based, content-based materials and instruction embraces this pedagogy. It is the presence of the guide and how prospective citizens experience citizenship that is counterintuitive. I have adapted a presentation by Dr. Carmel Borg to support this process. Dr. Borg is a professor of educational studies at the University of Malta. Our work is the context of adult language education for social change as learners are seeking to achieve CLB4 so they may apply for citizenship. First, we must place ourselves in our materials and classroom. We must interpolate our experience and our biography into the class and content by positioning ourselves. So the question is, are we locating ourselves within the program so we can build relationality with learners? Next, we must understand the context of our teaching and learning space. Adult learners need CLB4 to apply for citizenship. Learners need to reproduce the Discover Canada Citizenship Guide verbatim to obtain citizenship. Learners have precarious immigrant status. Learners study while working and supporting their families. Learners may have trauma, culture shock, survivor guilt, or health problems. Learners experience pressure to learn English or French. Learners may have difficult socioeconomic conditions that can impact their educational progress. Learners range in career, education, and skill. And those are just a few things to be thinking about. We must also understand it is morally and ethically intolerable to ignore these conditions that can divide the learning community. Finally, we have our scientific situational awareness. Link is well funded. Intake is constant. Learners have flexibility. Assessment is through the PBLA, which removes stress. Well, it lowers the stress and pressure of testing. Learners document their progress in the PBLA by producing artifacts to demonstrate their proficiency. Using critical pedagogy means that adult learners read and dialogue with learners as a commitment towards critical engagement with the world as a moment, a class, a conversation, and a history of life. The social justice perspective is the ability and commitment to the language of critique. By reading the world critically together so we can collectively act on the world. Reproducing materials such as the guide is counterintuitive to this pedagogy. Linking language acquisition to authentic dialogue supports communication and pragmatic understanding. By creating a community of learning and praxis, our commitment for critique is through a transformation in which these two dimensions weld together. They are language of critique, which is reading the words, language of possibility, acting on the words. There is no transformation unless the educator transmits hope. If the educator loses hope, there is fatalism. If there is paralysis in education, there is no way we can change. Our pedagogy must include hope. In the context of hope, Freire referred to the challenge of fatalism as the necrophilic notion of life. So a necrophile is an educator who has lost hope and is dancing with death. If the educator is dancing with life, the educator has hope. They are a biophile. They have the innate human instinct to connect with other living things. The social aspect of learning must engage respect. By validating the other and validating the other's knowledge as a collective, it is a participatory democracy. Learners and teachers are agents of democracy, not objects, but active participants engaging in knowledge creation. Freire saw human nature as dialogic. As language teachers, we see it too. Dialogue informs our learners' language acquisition. Freire believed that communication has a leading role, as we are constantly in dialogue with others. In dialogue, we create and recreate ourselves. Educators must create conditions for dialogue that encourages the epistemological curiosity of the learner as a pedagogy that promotes free and critical learning. Distinguishing between dialogical actions promotes understanding, cultural creation, and transformation. By the way, that's my dog growling. She's teasing my cat because everybody upstairs knows that I'm recording down here, but they forgot to mind the animals. Sorry about that. Non dialogical actions deny dialogue, they distort communication and reproduce power. By shifting the paradigm, teachers and adult learners, particularly those of low socioeconomic status, benefit through productive engagement, through effective pedagogy modeling the following. So, this is about us humbling oneself, taking student feedback seriously, auditing courses and feedback, emphasizing objectives to include learner conditions, because we want them involved from the design, development, engagement, and assessment of the course. Learners are the protagonists, not the object. Stop preaching. Prescribe and transmit by involving learners through authentic dialogue. A real dialogue, an authentic dialogue. You open yourself to people's interrogation. So new knowledge is produced in collective action. Avoid the pseudo dialogue. If you already have the answers, you pretend you are dialoguing. So Freire's idea of dialogue as the importance of words through praxis is also recognizing differences in people. Freire also acknowledged that educators shape how students see the world and history. They must use language, minding the perspective of students. They must allow thematic investigation, the discovery of different relevant problems and ideas for different periods of time. The way we teach the guide enforces the banking concept of education and discourse of the master, because learners as prospective citizens must reproduce the guide, as the guide informs the test. In these pedagogies, the teacher is active and the student is passive. There is no dialogue. We can create dialogue using the guide without impacting the learner's prospects of passing the test by using facts. The basis of authentic dialogue is in truth. We have a problem when we solve it together. We must acknowledge that the guide is untruthful and racist, and there is no other alternative. Maintaining anti dialogical activity implicitly and explicitly rejects transformative projects, or at least limits them. So I just want to close before I talk about the activities. Um, that the text that Paulo Freire is very famous for is called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I highly recommend reading it. And I have provided a link in the main document where you can access the book online, the complete book. I also recommend a post-colonial scholar, Dr. Masood Raja, and he has his own YouTube channel. He explores not just Freire, but other theories and post-colonial scholars. But you can really grasp through his recordings and in relation to Freire's text, Freire's concepts and chapter discussions. Actually, something that Dr. Raja recommended was actually reading another text in partnership with Freire, which is by Frantz Fanon, and it's The Wretched of the Earth, which also talks about colonial violence. So Dr. Raja is responsive to inquiries, and so anyway, I've also provided a link to that in the document. About the activities. So see the document module 7 uh, for ways to bring critical pedagogical practices into the classroom. And, just be kind to yourself. Remember, critical pedagogy is ongoing, it's adaptive to our conditions. And, start slowly, just introduce these concepts so they are habitual. And don't be shy to share ideas with other teachers. And of course, create knowledge with your students. So, thank you for being in this module with me. And I hope to see you in Module 8, which is about Indigenous ways of teaching and learning. And my colleague Lindsay Brandt I'll be sharing a recording of her, and she is an Indigenous educator, and she provides foundations on Indigenous ways of teaching and learning, and it's an excellent module. Just really opens the door. It's like a gateway of more, more possibility of more learning, and this way we by engaging with her, like I found for myself, like I'm building more confidence in how I can decolonize the classroom, but also how I can um, bring in materials that are Indigenous voices as well. And I know that decolonizing the classroom can be, for some people, it's shuts them down. And so I think of it as humanizing the classroom. So the last thing I need to show you is the references, which of course are in the document, and along with hyperlinks that so you can go into a deeper review if necessary. Okay, thank you.